So, welcome everyone to the America House, to the MSc Youth Hub here in Munich in 2023. It's our pleasure to host this event tonight with the Young Security Conference, long-standing partner of ours. We have actually, this year will be the third time that we will organize the Young Security Conference in May, so make sure to come again to that event as well. It's a pleasure to announce such wonderful speakers, or just welcome those wonderful speakers tonight. Dr. Berti, welcome to the America House. Dr. Rowe, Professor Rowe, and Dr. Weiss. And also, and I have to look at my sheet, I'm sorry, and Ms. Winter, welcome to the America House. It's going to be an exciting event. I'm looking forward to this event, and I also like to mention that we also have a couple of other events going on right after this event at the big auditorium. There's another one. If there are still places free, feel free to join us if you want to, or come tomorrow and join the other events as well. It's going to be an interesting discussion, future of Europe in defense and security debates. I hope you have a great time and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Also a warm welcome on behalf of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Munich Security Conference, Young Security Conference, and of course, thank you to the America House for hosting us tonight. One word I wanted to say on the Young Security Conference is that the annual conference that's been announced, the program is online now, so you can find it on youngSecurityConference.de. It's a fairly new organization, if I understood it correct, from 2020, and brings together young experts, practitioners, and think tankers across to discuss European security and defense affairs and foreign security matters. So it's a good initiative, and I'm excited that we have this panel to discuss the fate of the European security and defense integration, to talk a little bit about strategic autonomy versus efficiency. Of course, you can see the title. I have a wonderful panel. Thank you for coming. So Dr. Benedetta Berti is head of the Policy Planning Office of the Secretary General of NATO. So we have a NATO perspective here. Professor David Rowe, a professor for political science. And we'll bring a little bit the US perspective, but in our conversation before, I hear a lot of European in you as well. So we'll see how we balance that out. And then, of course, we have Dr. Moritz Weiss, who's a professor at the LMU University in Munich. We discuss a little bit the defense aspect, but of course, European initiatives and maybe a little bit of the downsides, the ups, the benefits that we have now going forward, and of course, the German perspective maybe a little bit. So my name is Teresa Winter. I have the privilege to be chairing the debate, and please feel free, everybody who wants to ask a question. So we'll have a little bit of conversation here, but I encourage you, this is a conversation, so just raise your hand, let me know. We have at some point, and I will point it out, somebody with a microphone, so you can ask questions as well to the panel. We have about an hour. We don't have to be entirely strict on it, but we will keep to that schedule. So if it's 19:35 and I'll still ramble on, then somebody has to nod to me. So we will discuss European strategic autonomy, and I'll just give a very brief thought on it, and then I'll leave it to you because you're the experts. So for those of you who have followed it, it's been a terminology ongoing for a few years now. It started 2013 to 16, European security defense, to just find our own voice in Europe, if you will. Then if you categorize it, 17 to 19, it was a little bit this European interests in the face of a hostile geopolitical environment. I think I read that on the Parliament, EU Parliament research website, meaning Brexit, meaning Trump, meaning uncertainties, and the identified need to focus on EU interests. Then 2020, and we talk about, of course, supply chain issues and how to protect a little bit. And then the terminology fades a bit. And we talk about resilience, we talk about sovereignty. In Germany, actually, we don't say it European strategic autonomy, but sovereignty, just because we had a debate on that wording. So now we're here to discuss, is it efficient to have this discussion, since we had the Russian invasion in Ukraine? There's been so much changing in the European security landscape, the debate, a lot of initiatives ongoing, a lot of very good, I would say, EU initiatives as well, but of course a refocus a lot on deterrence and defense NATO. I'll leave that to you, Benedetta. So with that said, we have, I'd start right away with you, David. Because it's nice to pinpoint a little bit, and then we start with the US perspective maybe on it, before we go in the Europe and German and NATO, of course. So from a US perspective, how would you describe the efforts within the EU to become more autonomous, to develop this strategic, self-dependence a little bit more? How would you describe that, and what are the obstacles and maybe some advantages of some of those developments?
Okay, no, that's fine. Before I start, first I would just like to thank the Young Security Conference for inviting me. I would like to thank the Munich Security Conference and the Youth Hub for hosting this event, and the America House and the Neumann Foundation, or the Naumann Foundation as well. I also have to say that I'm going to be speaking personally, that none of my comments should be construed as conveying any position for the United States Department of State or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, both of which have funded my research while I've been in Europe. And so I'm speaking solely as an American professor. Okay. And in terms of Europe, I've lived on and off in Europe for a long time. My wife and I lived in Bonn, Germany in 1989 to 1991, where we witnessed the end of the Cold War firsthand. And in many ways, this is a rerun of that, where you see the fundamental structures that shape European and transatlantic politics are shifting. There is an uncertain future, and we have to do a lot of hard thinking about what's going to happen and how to prepare for it. The only difference is that was an era of hope, and this is not yet a time of hope, because we're still in the midst of a very severe crisis. In terms of European autonomy, I think the origins are really quite easy to understand. Europe and the United States share common values, but don't always share common interests. When I teach, I often use marriage analogies, right? I love my wife, we share common values. We don't always share common interests in what we want to do, and that marriage only works where we both feel secure in our dependency on the other person. And it's never been clear that Europe feels secure in its dependency on the United States. And partly the drive for the desire for strategic autonomy is a result of that dependence. And I think that's very easy for us to understand. It was submerged in the Cold War, in part because of the pressures of the Cold War, really comes out after the Cold War ends. And I think it's completely understandable. And I think if you want a healthy relationship between the United States and Europe as part of the transatlantic community, acknowledging that desire for strategic autonomy is really important. I think from the U.S. perspective, in part because it was built around not fundamental differences, but different interests. The U.S. perspective has always been to look slightly askance at discussions of strategic autonomy, because it was thought to be, a way of acting against the United States, which of course it was. Because where did it come from? It came from a difference of interest. What the past, since 2020, I think, this has shifted slightly, because both the pandemic and especially the war in Ukraine have really, I think, brought home to a lot of people that NATO and the EU are really complementary institutions, that strategic autonomy need not be a threat, that it can actually, to the United States, American interests, to the transatlantic community, can be a very important and valuable asset. And like a marriage, the key thing is not that, oh yeah, this is a good thing, but it's how you accomplish it, how you do it. And those are the critical issues that I see. And I think that it's when we see stuff like Macron's European political community, that seems to be pushing away from the idea of the transatlantic community. But I really, and we can go into this in the question and answer period, I don't think a kind of strategic autonomy that is independent of the transatlantic structures is either viable or wise. And I'll just leave that hanging out there, and we can go into the reasons in the Q&A, because I want to save time for other people.
Thank you. No, that's, I mean, I will dive into that if you agree on the complementarity of NATO and EU, that's one of the outcomes of 2022, if I can just narrow that down like that. And I'm sure that there will be some questions on how the US is helping or not in that, aspect of strategic autonomy, and then you ask yourself, so why would they have to help? But we'll go into the defense, also industrial capacity a little bit later. So turning to the NATO perspective, Benedetta, how did the strategic environment change within the last year towards, of course, European defense integration within NATO as well? Can you pinpoint some key developments and how the EU-NATO cooperation has evolved throughout the last year?
Sure. I mean, I would like to maybe start by zooming out before we zoom back in, because of course the most important story to tell about 2022 it's that of Russia starting a brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, peace being shattered in Europe, the post-Cold War era in which we thought that Euro-Atlantic era was a peace, that we could take that for granted, that our environment was one of predictability, stability, that we could sort of focus our attention elsewhere. I want to say all those, we have been disabused. For those of us who held on to those notions, I think the war in the last year should have been a stark reminder that none of that applies anymore. So before we talk about institutional relations, I think it's really important that we understand what type of security environment we live in. It's more complex, it's more fragile, it's more unpredictable. All-out war has returned to Europe. I do not know how this war will end. I do know that if I look at the midterm future, fragility, recurrent shocks, being pandemics, climate change, will continue to determine our security environment. The global geopolitical and geoeconomical balance of power is shifting. We see rise of strategic competition. We see authoritarian countries pushing back against the rules-based international order. This is led, of course, by Russia and China. This is very important because we need to acknowledge what is our security environment. And to me, if we acknowledge that the security environment we live in, there's many lessons we can draw. One is, of course, cannot take security and defense for granted. Two, if we are dealing with strategic competitors, if we're dealing with resurgence of competition, then of course, no country or even no continent alone is big enough to deal with these challenges. So if there is one moment in which we need to double down on the transatlantic relations, it's today. So I think we need to start with that. And then we can go about the how is the best way to make two different institutions work together. We can talk about it, and it's really important, and I think this war has shown that NATO and the EU can work in a complementary, coherent way, and should, because we have shared strategic interests and values. But I think we need to recognize that this has to be done in a transatlantic context. And you see it with the war in Ukraine. Who is supporting Ukraine today? Who is the lead supporter? Of course, you have the United States first, then United Kingdom, EU through the EU member states through the EU member states bilaterally. It's all together that we are able to support Ukraine to the extent that it needs to be supported to exercise its rights of self-defense. So I think it's just to say that's why when we talk about strategic autonomy, I always get a little bit puzzled. Well, first of all, because I don't know what it means, depends who you ask, right? He has different definitions, and that's important. But also because we are in such a historic, challenging time for, well, democracies worldwide, but for the transatlantic community at large, that I think it's really a call to work more together, which doesn't mean we always have to agree on everything. I do agree with that analogy. We have shared values. I think we have shared long-term strategic interest. We will have differences in interest that we will have to further because we have our national interest to take care of. But it's a roundabout way about to answer your question, and I can go more into the details of what more we can do together in the Q&A. But I think we need to start thinking. We need to start from the right premise, which is how do we unlock the combined leverage of the two organizations, so we work together. And really, this is not the time for competition or beauty contests, because we just can't afford it. It's just not the time. There is an all-out war in the middle of Europe that will have significant long-term consequences for security here at home. So I think we just have to work together.
Absolutely. Do you think that there was a time that there was a competition?
I think some rhetoric can be seen as that. For example, if you're thinking about it, again, it depends how you talk about it. If you're talking about, and that's something that I think is really important, how do we strengthen the European capacity? How do we strengthen European capabilities so that European allies in NATO can do more? How can Europeans take more charge of the crisis in their neighborhood? I think that's incredibly important. If you talk about it in this sense, no, it's not about competition. If you're talking about how do we replace or how do we wean ourselves away, that's something that I don't understand. Also because of reality, 80% of the capabilities and the 80% of what is spent in defense within NATO is spent outside of the European Union. And then I take a look at the map of Europe and I look at it and I think, can we really defend Europe without Turkey in the south? Without Norway in the north, without the United Kingdom, without the United States? No, we cannot. But also we shouldn't. Why? We are so much stronger when we work together. So it's a matter of framing. But if you're talking about European countries through the EU and bilaterally doing more for their defense and security, spending more, spending better, pooling resources, then yes, absolutely, that's great. We have to.
So in whose interest is it to pursue a strategic autonomy? And let's go away from the definition, let's go away from its independence from the US, let's take a little bit out the kind of the grain of salt there, but just go into, so whose interest is it to really have a strong EU? Moritz, in your opinion, what's the benefit of a European strong defense integration? Let's phrase it that way first before we can go back and be a little bit more nitty-gritty, but so what's the benefit of a stronger European consolidation in security and defense? And if you want to, what is or should the role of Germany be within that as a strong European, of course, member state and maybe leader of some sorts?
And I think there is actually a major difference what the role is and what it should be. But I will come to that in the end. And I would like, first of all, to say something on Benedetta, because I completely agree with your analysis that it's a quite new, a very challenging situation. But what I do not agree with is it's not uncertain. I think the big difference to the time before is it is very clear. There's a clear enemy, there's a clear strategic competition. And I would even argue that this is maybe the reason why it is relatively smooth. So I think that, and I would also go back to what you said of, quite obviously there was competition from the very outset. You know, when you look at the first documents, when Europe started to initiate something like the common foreign and security policy or the European security and defense policy, it was always in the first sentence, in a way, strategic autonomy. Great, and the French were happy about that. But of course, in the same document, it was written basically primacy of NATO. So it is still the primary organization being responsible for collective defense. And when you look at Berlin Plus and all the agreements, it was always, in the end, there will be NATO's primacy. So I think that we have arrived at a point at the moment, like for maybe, let's say, 1 or 2 years, maybe already a bit beginning already with Brexit and with the Trump presidency, that it's more moving into some sort of collaboration, complementarities. I would argue to some extent that autonomy is not efficient or cannot be efficient. So, but it is basically a division of labor that is or that can be efficient. And then, of course, when we are within a division of labor, we obviously face the problem that we have a lot of converging interests, but we also have some diverging interests. And when we have a division of labor, then we need to some extent trust each other. And this is, of course, then the challenge. I think at the moment we don't have it, but we will maybe get into these trust problems again. So the European interest is clearly one that, I don't know, that makes clear that it has a say. I think it is also at the moment very clear that it can deliver something also on the military field, not so much by organizing it, but to some extent by playing the game of hiding. You know, who is training Ukrainian soldiers at the moment? It's not an EU mission because the EU is so brilliantly in doing that. Of course, NATO would be probably the better place to do, but it is to some sense accommodating to Russia. So it's good. So there are great opportunities to collaborate, to really draw on the quite unique advantages that both organizations have. And then the question, of course, becomes like, what is the German role in that? And I think at the moment it's this eternal struggle for leadership. And what I think is, I think that at the moment they are not doing it too badly, actually. But I think the main problem, and also of the German discourse on that, is to some extent that we are now slightly or slowly getting into this: with power comes responsibility, we have to do something. So it's changing. But I think what is not changing actually in Germany at the moment is this, you know, when you have power and you make decisions, you make mistakes. And you are responsible for these mistakes. And I think this is what the US is doing across the world. And of course, it is blamed for that. And I think that from a German perspective, to some extent, what we need to learn is being able, being willing to enter into political decisions and also to make political mistakes.
If I can follow up on one thing. So you said that, and that's actually something that everybody can, if they want to answer on, is that the EU to do something to integrate their defense efforts. If you look at, let's say, joint exercises or joint command structures, we don't want to repeat anything, but you said that it's not going to work because there's not enough trust. So what would you say about these bilateral efforts? I mean, look at the Dutch-German example of integrating land forces, or look at some French-German initiatives. So is that all? I mean, that's all within, of course, NATO. If you look at certain exercises, there's a lot going on there. But is that something where you'd say, wow, that's actually adding to an autonomous? I mean, autonomy doesn't mean that EU has to do something as an institution as a whole, maybe. But there could be several like bilateral or multilateral ways to strengthen and bolster efforts.
Shall I?
You could start, yeah.
Sure. I just try to be brief, to not take too much space. So I think for sure. So I think all the PESCO projects are very nice things, and you can have some. It's great to have a minister signing it and everything. But I think the pragmatic ones that you mentioned, they are the ones that make the difference in the long term. But they will not make a difference like tomorrow. But I think in the long term, they will be absolutely essential to move forward, because there won't be a European army, that's for sure. And so there should be pragmatic collaboration at these stages, because these lower levels are much less politicized, and that may work.
Yes, please.
No, maybe just to add that I think there's a number of areas where if you want to think about areas in which the European Union can and does add value to European security and defense, there's many. One of them is military mobility, because the EU has regulatory power, and we have to do a lot to improve the infrastructure that we have so that we can move our troops so that they can be at the right place at the right time without legal logistics hurdles. So that's one very specific role where within the EU competency, they can play a real difference with infrastructure, with regulation, with incentive, to make sure that the European and the Euro-Atlantic deterrence and defense posture is more credible because we have better infrastructure. There's one. It's maybe not as sexy as others, but it's real. We need it. And the EU can do it and is doing it. Resilience and critical infrastructure. It's absolutely crucial. Our security depends on it. Our militaries depend on civilian highways, roads, 5G network, civilian satellite. These are all very, very important areas where there is, again, they are about security and defense, and there is a key EU role, another one, and then I'll stop. But it's really important. Production, incentivize industrial production. Our industrial production defense industry for decades has been producing differently and less, not at the mass and scale that we need today. So what we need to do is give them a signal for the long term that we will need to ramp up production because we need it for ourselves and because we need it to support Ukraine.
So increase defense spending, so people can...
Increase defense spending, of course. I mean, otherwise, with what?
How would you increase
I mean, I don't understand.
production?
Sometimes we have this debate, and I'm like, maybe there's something very profound that I don't understand, but if you don't have the money to buy stuff, like, what are you gonna... Yeah, right? I mean, this... Yeah, it's basic, it's easy, but sometimes think we can start with the easy. First of all, let's have the cash that we need. But then it's about spending better, and then the EU can really, really help by pooling, by sharing. So I think there's very concrete areas that, to me, can add real value, perhaps more than creating parallel structures. For example, you say command structure, but we have one set of forces. You're going to split them into two command structures, but then we're going to have, instead of one that does 100%, two that have 50. Does that make...
I think we're far away from that again.
Does that make sense in a world in which 96% of EU citizens live in a NATO country and our resources are finite? It's a policy question. It's not for me to decide, but I think we need to consider whether it's worth it.
Yes.
And there's just one more aspect, I think, that has to come here, which is that security is not just simply a military problem. And it's also an economic problem, and strategically, it's how we manage our economic relations with other parts of the world. And in the war in Ukraine, the sanctions would not have been possible without the European Union. And so when we think about how it is we provide for security, we have to both the military force is core to that, but it's not the only thing that we have to think about. And when we think about the institutional setting, it's what are those institutions that we need in order to generate a secure environment, and it also means managing our economic policies and economic strategies as well. And so you can't have a complete, I would say, transatlantic, dialogue about security without having, a substantial economic voice in the room. And the EU is incredibly important for that.
Absolutely. I've already seen a few hands raised. Can I see where the microphones? Who has the microphone to go around? Thanks. So up here in the front, there's a few questions. Can we just start with the third row and then go in the front? Please state quickly your name and affiliation if you want to, and then quick question. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. So I'm Margot Boucher. I'm from Belgium, currently civilian. I'm working at the patent office, but that's it. So a big question I'm having, and it's both an issue with NATO and the European Union, and I think that's at the root of both the problem for this increased funding, that we should, we all realize that we should increase the funding, but if you bring this up in a Western European country like my own, which has spent a lot of money on F-16s, F-35s, however, I'm not a military expert, a big thing that you get the entire population, but why? Why should we spend so much money being from tiny, tiny Belgium, who, for us, the last time we had a war was 70 years ago, and that's also the rhetoric that we use when we're talking about the European Union and how great it is. It's like, yeah, it's thanks to the European Union. We haven't had war in Europe for 60, 70 years. Despite what happened in the Balkans, we're completely ignoring that, because for us, are they really Europe? So there's this divide between Western Europe and the East that's very well aware of what Russia is doing, and it's at the root of why we can get extra funding. So this is an issue in both NATO or in any potential plan that the European Union would want to make about having a European army, and this isn't simply going to disappear. What do you suggest doing about that? Because the war in Ukraine is, for us, it seems like, it's getting solved soon, right? Like, at some point, right? No, that's what the feeling, I'm just, no, I'm just saying, this is This is what I feel like people in my country are thinking about it in any case.
Okay.
All right, that's just...
No, thank you for that question. I think, can we collect? We
Yeah.
just get another two questions? Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Benjamin Tallis, German Council on Foreign Relations. I'd actually like to pick up on that a little bit, because I think this, in justifying increased defense spending, absolutely making the benefits of that clear to our populations, bringing them on board, is key. And this relates to what was said about values and interests. And it also relates to a remark by German Foreign Minister Baerbock last week in Berlin, when she, and I quote here, said the distinction between our values and our interests is quote unquote total crap. And that was in English, and this is what she actually said. Why do I bring this up? Because of the comment that was made at the beginning, mentioning that we have similar values, or we have shared values but diverging interests. We have yet to make clear to our populations that defending, preserving, reviving those values as our interests is at the heart of winning the conflict in Ukraine, at the heart of reinforcing NATO to the extent that it can make sure that those interests and values survive, but also giving the European Union the chance to make our societies thrive. And it's that division of labor, getting that surviving, thriving division between the two organizations right, that should be at the heart, I think, of our policy going forward. So I'm grateful to the panel that they've managed to say there is no real competition, or not a sensible competition to have there. But I'd be interested in their views to know a little bit on the continued both-siding that does seem to be going on, the middle way that certain European politicians seem eager to find, even in this new situation of clarity, to avoid a new Cold War with China, for example, which is also a threat to our values as our interests. And even Olaf Scholz, who's talked about going back to the pre-war peace order, which he saw as working. I don't think that was working for enough of our populations to actually ensure those values and interests are rightly served. Thank you.
Thank you. And then one last in the front before we go back to the panel, and then we open. I see in the back already some hands, but let's start with 3 rounds, and then we go back, and then we get more questions. And I see you too, the next round.
Thank you very much. Anna Zubkova from University of Bundeswehr in Munich. I'm agile coach. And a question about spending money. I've heard, and I know for sure, that there is enough money to spend, at least for Bundeswehr, with the Sondervermögen that we got, but unfortunately the structures of Beschaffung, I'm not sure how to translate Beschaffung, procurement, they're so rigid. So I just want to hear, do you have any ideas maybe how we can improve it?
Thank you. So I'll give it back. We have one question on procurement. Thank you. We have a question on how to really explain to the population. Maybe go back to, so are we at risk? So why are we here to spend more money? What is the security environment really also for the Western European countries that may have a divided view on that? And then the values and interest question. Do we understand what's at hand? Going back to a security order of, before might be just naive. I don't know, I'm rephrasing, but I'll give it back to you. Anybody who wants to you want to take the lead?
Sure, the first thing about the why do we have to spend money on war if we live in a world of peace is a perennial question. And the problem is that when you live in a peaceful society, it seems so self-evidently natural, right? Because the benefits are there, and so it's just easy to understand why you would want to live in a society like this. And what you don't see are the deep underlying structures that actually generate social trust so that we can live in a world where we trust one another. And the way I like to explain it when I teach is, well, I do the following. I ask my students, I say, how many of you, and I'll ask the audience, how many of you have ever wanted to hurt somebody? Maybe it was when you're growing up, they really ticked you off and you just wanted to hit them. It could have been on the playground, and everybody raises their hand, right? Because we've all been there. We've all gotten really mad and just wanted to hurt somebody because somebody really just sort of annoyed us. And so, and that establishes that fact. This is part of human nature, that we do violence to other humans. And then I ask, how many of you fear it? And they all fear it. And then I ask him, how many of you know that it's useful because somebody has intimidated you at some point in your life and you've done something that you didn't want to do, or you've intimidated someone else? And they all raised their hand because we've all been there. And so what this tells us is that the human capacity for violence, the human capacity to hurt and kill, is the fundamental problem we have to solve if we're going to create peaceful, ordered societies. And that means we have to take it under control. And the way we do that is we basically build it in as that central mechanism that we use to generate peace. And once it works, you know, peace just looks so natural that all of this force and all of the other, the rule of law, all of that is just invisible in the background. And so it's really hard. It's hard to make that clear because our own eyes tell us that all of that force is unnecessary. And this is the challenge, I think, that everyone in this room who works on security faces. Because it looks like when it works, it looks like wasted effort. When it doesn't work, it looks oh so important. And I don't have a good answer, except just to say just that. We need it. In terms of values and interests, I respectfully disagree with your foreign minister. And in the following way, that even when you have similar values and those similar values lead to, you know, similar strategic interests, there will still be points at which you will differ. And one of the key points, and it goes back actually to the question on, you know, from the Belgian person in the audience, was, you know, just think, you know, defensive promises are easy to make when we live in times of peace. They're hard to keep when we live in times of war because nobody wants to be on the front line. We would all be very much, you know, happy if someone else, you know, some other nation's soldiers were getting shot and killed and things like that. And this has been a problem that NATO has had to solve. And the way that it did so, and this reveals my age. I don't know if people still talk about the layer cake defense of NATO during the Cold War, but if you looked along the central front, what you had were different sectors, which were the responsibilities of different NATO members, and this was before interoperability. This was before, you know, that we had. And the whole idea was that any attack in Europe would immediately engage Belgium, it would engage Luxembourg, it would engage the United States, it would engage Germany with real losses, and in a way that would make the common commitment credible. And that's where, you know, interests diverge, and you have to find a way around that. And being able to speak with people, having good actors who trust you, is critical to having those kinds of conversations.
So, Benedetta, what's your view on that? Would you agree that
which point? I would go back to the question maybe because I think it's so important, and I acknowledge that we need to do better at explaining this, especially to our younger population, and especially to those in Western Europe who have been by winning some type of lottery, have grown up throughout a generation of peacetime. They have not experienced war. They have not experienced that from within, and that is fantastic. It's a wonderful achievement. But of course, the problem is, and that reiterates a little bit of point made before, that can generate a level of complacency or a level of neglecting the fact to acknowledge something really simple. I'm not a very deep person, but freedom is not free, democracy is not free, security is not free. Maybe we didn't see, even when you talk about a peace project, which the EU is, and it's really, really important, but what was it built on? It was built on the fact that our security was taken care of. It was built on a NATO structure. It was built on the fact that during the Cold War, we had, and we continue to have, a strong nuclear deterrent. Our security was ensured, and when your security is ensured, you can work on development, you can work on reconstruction, you can work on political reforms, you can build your democracy, because your security is taken care of. And I think that's something that we need to really understand, that when our security is not taken care of, when we're not able to defend ourselves, our prosperity will lag behind, our democracy will lag behind. This is not about some esoteric debate. If there is conflict in Europe, it will affect us, and it could jeopardize some of those gains that we have benefited from for many years. But I think that it's very, we tell ourselves that, and we all believe that probably in this room, but we need to do a better job at engaging others and explaining the value of security, the value of defense, and also the fact that once you have an armed force that are capable, competent, well-trained, responsible, you're going to need them. Natural disasters, the pandemic shows how much we need our armed forces. So I think it's also about rebuilding a culture where we understand that important relationship that they play in ensuring our security and also supporting our democracy. So there's a lot of rethinking and redoing. I think maybe this war, this horrible war that shocked us but didn't surprise us, unfortunately, can be a wake-up call for many of our societies in terms of rethinking a little bit how much we want to, we are willing and able to sacrifice in order to have our security. And ultimately, it's not just security, it's about our freedom and democracy. So, but I don't have a good answer because we need to have that conversation a lot more, I think.
One last, very quick, do you have a thought on procurement?
Do I have a bottom on procurement? But we have someone from actual Germany here that maybe we can... Fine. Do I have a bottom?
He will have to say something on it. But
I'm sorry, I just dodged the ball. No, but it's clear. It's clear. The point is the point, and I already spoken too much, but I acknowledge it's a really good question because, of course, it's not just about having more money. You also have to have systems that allow you to spend them well. You have to have systems that are agile, that take the right amount of time to deliver, that allow you to pool resources. So there are institutional obstacles. I'm not minimizing them, and they're different in different allied countries, and that's another area in which the EU can help. But the bottom line, and I'm going to go back to the fact that I'm a simple person. The bottom line is, at least you have to have that budget to spend, because if you don't have it, then you can have the greatest procurement system in the world, it's still not going to cut it. So, meaning doing better of one doesn't fix the problem of underspending. You need to do both, in my opinion.
So, Morris, you have a take on...
Just a brief take on that, I think, from two sides. First of all, other countries also suffer from catastrophic procurement systems. So it's not a German phenomenon. It's go to the US. It's not different, or maybe it's different, but it's still a catastrophe. So first of all, then when you compare it not to defense procurement but to procuring computers for kids, the big digital initiative, that did not suffer from money. There was a huge budget, but they were impossible to get it in a way because the procedures were so complex. That means it's not only defense in Germany, but it's basic public procurement problem. Then the solution, of course, is difficult because when you give it to some extent a free hand to the procurers, then you have less competition and you have higher prices. So it's a difficult thing, but I think that meanwhile everybody agrees that there has to happen something, and to some extent it happens now with the Sondervermögen. At least they are a bit faster in some respects. But I think I think so. I think to one question I would like to add, because I think that's really an important one, because I think it's completely mistaken to argue that values and interests are the same, and I think for I'd say a very good reason, or I tried to make a good point on that. What is what is the limit to our support of Ukraine? What is when we say there's a value, and the value is territorial integrity, and I don't know, self-determination, democracy. Okay, so but is it that would be the value, but what would it imply? It would imply revisionist Russia for the next 20 years. That may be our value, because when we, when Ukraine kicks out Russia from the whole territory before 2014, you will always have some revisionism in Moscow, no matter whether it's Putin or whether it's someone else. You will always have that. And from a value perspective, that must be the objective. I think that from an interest perspective, then we can talk about maybe we need to find an agreement, maybe we need to build a European security order after that war. Maybe we need to make some concessions, even though they do not correspond to our values, because normally it's not peaceful parties that make a peace, but it's warring parties that have very divergent interests. So I think it's important to get back into a debate on interests, because then we are able to make politics, to make concessions, and to find, to be nevertheless credible and showing strong resolve, but in a way being able to find a future solution. And that's why I think it's very dangerous just to argue in terms of values.
We have a follow-up here before because there's some
very quickly, because I see there are
Yes.
questions and I don't want to get in the way, but I do have to say one point where I'm not necessarily 100% sure I agree, and that is, I mean, the value versus interest presentation, I think that's really pertinent, germane, and I do agree with that it's not always the same. But on this specific point, my view is that if we were the type of revisionism and the type of rhetoric that comes out of the Kremlin today, and I think the potential cost of a victory, of those ambitions being fulfilled, I think if one is afraid of what would happen for defeat, I think we should be much more concerned what happens next, what is the message for this revisionist Russia if it were to succeed in Ukraine. Who's next? That would be my first question. And where would this end? And the second would be, what signal will we send to other authoritarian governments? What would Beijing learn in terms of what is allowed, what is possible, and how you can behave on the war scene? So I'm just saying that from my perspective, actually, the price of appeasement, which is something that maybe we tried, maybe didn't work so well, it's very high, and I think we need to reflect on that. But I don't dismiss the point that values and interests are sometimes lead us to make very difficult strategic trade-offs. Just oh, nice! I got a clap.
I will bring you back to the room. I saw a hand in the back, and there's one in the front and another one here in the front. Can you please, because in the interest of time, be as concise as possible? Sorry for that. I know that we have a lot to discuss.
No problem. So my name is
Can you
Antonia.
stand up?
Okay. So my name is Antonia Pup, and I come from Romanian Parliament. And you all know Romania. We defend the largest NATO border with Ukraine right now. And my question to you is: do you think that the Western European countries, after the war in Ukraine, have now a duty to be more sensitive on what's happening right now in the eastern flank, in the wider Black Sea region, and maybe have a more mature dialogue before talking about autonomous common foreign and security policy between the Western EU countries and the Eastern European countries? Because right now we are having a dialogue on allowing 3% of our GDP on budget for defense, and I don't see the same from our Western allies as I see it from other non-EU allies.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, really quick, and then we go to the front here, and of course to you, sir.
I'm Yula Summer. I'm currently interning with the European representation here, but I'm not affiliated with that question here. My question is about the initial conversation about how good it is to have these bilateral cooperation within. But I was wondering, I feel like a lot of the conversation, it's often about NATO and member states, but it's not actually about EU and NATO. So even in Brussels, you see headquarters up there. There's no conversation happening. No, right now we have an American, a German, and NATO, no one from the EU. So maybe we can talk about that. How, if there is there a problem with that, or yeah, maybe.
Thank you. That was quick and dirty. One to the front, please. Very quick, and then we have a last question before we go back.
Thomas Kropka speaks for himself, not for any organization. He speaks about values. And I think the main title of values is individual freedom. And if you look for the last 50, 60 years, the output of this is a lot of abominations, as you know. And this is the reason why God is making war against Ukraine and against Europe. How you want to protect without giving answer to the abominations which makes God angry. How you will want to protect Europe or the NATO.
Thank you. And then the last question in the second row to the end.
My name is Martina Timmermann. I'm associated to several think tanks like CSIS or AICGS and so on. So I'm also talking for myself right now. I would actually like to be the devil's voice at the end of this. And you are responsible, Professor Rowe, because you triggered it. This is about autonomy versus efficiency. And I've been thinking about, all the time, this whole day, I've been thinking about private security providers. Nobody has mentioned that. Now, if we break this down, autonomy versus efficiency, wouldn't it be the most efficient way to buy security? I don't say I like that, but we do have an increase in private security providers to a very strong extent. We are only talking of Wagner, but there are others too. You know that. So I know I have to be very short now. When I was working for the United Nations University, I was also dealing with special rapporteurs. There was a special rapporteur on child soldiers. Those child soldiers were somewhat re-educated, re-traumatized by the European Union. Afterwards, when they couldn't find a job, they were sent for cheap money, $230, to Afghanistan, for instance. Whereas British soldiers from private security providers cost $1,200 per day. In the Congress, United States Congress, there was a question round, and one of them said, one of your politicians said, when do African child soldiers have to pay for being sent to war? Now, this is the background why I'm asking to figure in this private security dimension into this discussion, because it is somewhat, it seems to me somewhat forgotten, but it's vital if we plan for the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Amelie, did you have a quick question, or did you, otherwise I would go back to the panel. Very quick.
Yeah, hi, Amelie from the Young Security Conference. So I just had a very quick question regarding the Zeitenwende, how you see it respectively, because it's not only German now, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, that's a good quick question.
The Zeitenwende.
Sorry, the Zeitenwende, yes. So we have a number of questions. We're approaching the end of our time. It's a bouquet, I know, so you can pick and choose however you want to. I'll just repeat it for you, and you can just say whatever you want to jump in. So we have the Zeitenwende question, respectively. We have what happens after Ukraine, if I understood you correctly. So is the Western European Union or Western nations aware of their Eastern partners enough? Do we look at Black Sea security enough? Where is the EU and NATO engagement? Is not visible. And then I don't know if you can respond to that question about the private, do we buy security? I mean, that is an important aspect. We'll see how we can get to that.
Oh, 30 seconds? 30, I'll just start with the NATO EU, and because we're at the end, I'm going to have extremely synthetic, but since 2016, we really, the level of cooperation between NATO EU stuff has really, really grown exponentially. I mean, I could be very bureaucratic and go through the 74 areas of cooperation we have, but I will spare you. And instead, I will say that it's very extensive, from cyber to hybrid. And now we're just working on extra resilience, climate change, strategic competition. So I think, of course, we can and we are determined to continue to do better, but we are not starting from a bad place, absolutely not. I would say it's almost a reflex between when we work on security, that there is a dialogue, there are cross-briefing, there are exchanges. That's the way it should be. So I think there the glass is really half full. And then the other question on should we do better of understanding the security perspective and of our allies in the eastern flank front states, that's a very good question, and it was more a comment than a question, and my response will be yes, you're right, I think. So I'll leave it at that, and then we can have a much longer conversation. And Zeitenwende, yes, please. I think a lot of, I think this is something that many Europeans are looking to with a lot of hope, and to have a strong Germany politically, economically, and also more committed on the security and defense front, and with a strong European and transatlantic orientation is something that that would be very beneficial for Europe. So that's the shortest I can be.
Thank you.
All right. The attention to the eastern flank, I think one of the problems that's, NATO is constantly, and the transatlantic community, the European Union, constantly have to, be aware of is that interests do differ, and that leads to differences in perceptions, that leads to differences in feelings about, are people doing enough? And so I think the comment about the, sort of the eastern flank, here's what we see, and we don't see the same concerns, the further west you go, I think that's appropriate, that's clear and appropriate. And that's why we need to pay very close attention to institutions that enable those kinds of differences to be voiced and to be resolved. That's what good institutions are for. I can't really speak to the bilateral conversations between NATO and the EU in the way that Bernadetta has, but my observations are when I was in Brussels in the fall and in the early winter is they're there. And when I would talk to people on both sides, they would tell me that they're there in a way that is really quite new, and I think actually quite hopeful. In terms of sort of abominations that make God angry, I think that we have moral choice, and that this is what makes what we do so serious, is that these are moral choices that we're making that affect the world that we live in, and that have that it's not just debates, it's about the world, and that whether or not people flourish is going to depend on the choices that we make, and so we have to be very serious and consequent and intentional about them. And so I absolutely agree with you.
You know the abominations.
Yeah.
But you don't speak about.
Okay. Yeah. No, I know. And in terms of the private security, I think that this is probably for building a liberal world. This is one of the worst routes to go down. Our capacity to hurt one another is so great that we want it under public control. And the problem is when it's not under public control, you don't know, it just terrible things happen, and it needs to be controlled. And and so I think that this is one of those sort of hidden issues that if we want to build a liberal world order and really make it a true liberal world order, this is one of those hidden issues that we really need to bring out into the open and manage. And frankly, my government has been awful with this. That a lot of the United States hires out a lot of its security, and it just should not do that, because we're giving these people the power to hurt and kill other people, and they need to be responsible to public authority, and private security forces are not. And then finally, I think, yes, it's a Zeitenwende, and it's a Zeitenwende not just in Germany, but generally. I put in a proposal for my research in Europe, and I thought that I was going to be talking about, the potential, sort of NATO's problems with managing whether or not the United States would continue to be committed to Europe in the future. At least under this administration, that problem has gone away. And I think that there's a general recognition that we do share common interests, or excuse me, that we do share common values, and we both have the United States and Europe have a common interest in building a world built around liberal values. And That was not necessarily clear, I think, before 2020 and especially before 2022.
Thank you. Moritz.
Not much on the table left, so let me just... well, one thing, because I think it's important for and also one of the challenges of understanding of what is going on there, that NATO and the EU are really very different organizations. And let's say in the defense part, there are similarities. But also when you just look at the news and it's always, like Michel and on the other hand, von der Leyen. So there is, of course, one really supranational part that plays a much lesser role in defense. But that is important, and I would argue that it will become important, much more important in terms of the Zeitenwende, because I think what we not only see is, to some extent, like a transformation of defense and of European security, but what, of course, one of the questions to Europe is from an economic perspective, where do we position ourselves between China and the US? Because the same will be, we have some converging interests, but there is also real conflict here. And here, that will be, I think, one of the big questions, to what extent the Zeitenwende that we have in European security will ultimately also have an impact on, let's say, our globalized world, and maybe not just to make it a better and easier place, but probably a more difficult one. So let's see.
With that said, and with the
on
look
this
at
happy note,
on this happy note, no, I recognize that we have a lot more to discuss, and there's many aspects that did not receive enough attention. And of course, I know that there's going to be more conferences, more talk. So we probably have to look at how we go into some of these topics a little bit more in detail, because we have 1 minute. I want to ask one question, really quick and dirty, to all of you. What keeps you up at night?
Oh.
If you think about European security and defense.
okay, not my kids.
What keeps you up? It's a popcorn style. So whoever has an idea first, you just...
I have two things.
Go.
The first is an escalation or expansion of the war, geographically. The second is a Zeitenwende in the United States after 2024, but in the other direction.
Okay, thank you.
Honestly, it's a really long list, but if I think you can summarize it by the prospects that we do not rise to the challenge of this security environment, which I think it's really serious. And what we're seeing so far, and it's only 1 year into this brutal war, is that we are stepping up, but we need to keep this. We need to keep this level of resolve. Otherwise, I very much fear the consequences.
Thank you.
Basically, or tying into that, re-establishing European order.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful debate, way too short, and I thank you also to the audience for being so attentive and asking questions. And yeah, round of applause for the panel, please.
And for the moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you.